said Ms. Arquette was the inspiration for the title of this 1982 hit. Lisa. Oh.
Okay, we're getting there.
Hi.
Hi, Alan. Everybody just hold on for a minute, please.
Okay, Dan. How are you?
Very frustrated at the moment.
Isn't technology great?
No. And since we're broadcasting live, I can't say what I really feel. Okay, it says recording. You know, all the instructions that we went through, none of them work.
You didn't do a practice round, Dan?
Gentlemen, ladies, please give me a minute or two or 10 or 20. Okay, I don't see. All right, I'm assuming it says recording that we're live, and then we just will keep going. None of the things that we went through on the practice approach are coming up the right way, so I have no idea what we're doing. I hope this is doing right, but anyway, let's keep on going. Charles, the meeting is yours. You have a quorum. No, you don't. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4. We need one more. No,
Right.
we have a quorum. It's 4 out of 7. Right. Okay. You have a quorum. You can start, Charles. You need a motion to open.
Fantastic. So a motion to open our January Budget Advisory Committee meeting.
I make a motion to open the meeting.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Can we have a motion to approve our minutes from last month's December meeting?
I make a motion to approve December's meeting minutes.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Can we have a volunteer to take the minutes for the January meeting? Len took them last month. If somebody would be so kind as to do them for this month.
I'll do it, Charles.
Thank you, Ellen. So,
Charles, before you start, if I may, okay, to all those who are listening and then view later on, I apologize for my being technically challenged, but all the stuff that we went through did not work, and then it locked me out for a half an hour, and it still doesn't work the way it's supposed to, but it seems to be working. But in either event, in the interim, I sent you all a email with the village manager's path forward on what we are doing to try and stop the floodgates in the pandemic. I know you haven't had a chance to review it, but that's what I was supposed to do earlier today, but I couldn't get to it. So now the floor is yours, Charles. I didn't mean to.
no problem. And I suppose it would be an option, depending on various people's comfort levels, to look at that document, or we can just digest it offline and go from there with it. But that's an option. And we can get to that one.
Yeah.
I did take a quick look at it, and some of the things that are laid out are very much in line with what we have in our document.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have, Dan, is the first paragraph says expenditures are at 47% and revenues are at 38%. Okay, so expenditures are running faster than revenue. But what's the size of the gap?
It depends on when you ask and what's included, but it can be up to a total. It's the upward limit has been estimated at 2.5 million.
Okay.
The lower limit can be somewhat lower. There are a tremendous number of variables. I think Glenn was on the Zoom board meeting when we got into this in the work session. It is, whoops, okay, you're sharing, okay. I think the issue is that it's going to be significant. The question is just how significant.
You know, when I used to be CFO, if I gave that answer, I would have been shot to the board if I gave that answer, because it just seems to me that Jerry's obligation is to say, at least offer a couple of scenarios. We're more than halfway through the fiscal year, and say, okay, here are the trends. If they continue, here's the final gap. I don't understand that, but anyway, that's just my frustration. I apologize. I apologize.
No, Len, I understand that, and part of it is my communication skills on this. He has told us that the gap is 2.5 million. The approaches to stop the gap are listed in that I sent you.
Yeah.
There are a lot of variables in all of this that are obviously an issue. My gut is that we are going, he believes that he can stop all or most of the gap. I'm not so sure.
So Dan, is the gap inclusive of the reimbursement we were getting for pandemic stuff or
Yes.
not?
Yes.
So after we get the money back, we still have the 2.5 million gap.
You could have up to 2.5 million gap. I do not want to mischaracterize it.
I wrote upward, but
Glenn Tippett, I can help you out with some of the numbers because I've done some crunching. On the revenue side, we're actually probably looking at being on the plus side when you talk about the sales tax. From what we've collected, and I went on to the New York State site of what Westchester has gotten, the first half of the year, Westchester was running about, probably an average somewhere around 14% over last year, but that was due to the 1% increase. The last 3 months, we're probably down 2 to 3% from last year. But understand what we actually collected last year was 3.6 or 3.7. It was somewhere in that range. We budgeted 3.2 this year. We can be over that line approximately $800,000. Then you come to the parking and the fines and forfeitures, and that erases most of that. There are a bunch of lines that we are actually over, seasonal parking, beach, and such like that. The biggest variables at this point is going to be state aid and how much money we're going to be bringing in for our parks and recreation and such. One of the questions I have to ask is things like softball, summer camp, and such as that. If we generate that revenue this year, is that actually revenue for next year? Because that's your other large shortfall. I can actually show you the numbers. If you look at that last printout in November, you can see where we're short and where we're minus. I actually took the whole budget, and what I did was I simply extrapolated out the 2 lines for the recovery from pandemic and from the storm waste, because those lines are going to be either revenue neutral or it's going to cost us money. We're not going to collect more money for those 2 lines. the pandemic, from what I understand from Jerry, we were looking at an 80% recovery, but they hired a company to see if we could get more recovery than that. But if you take those two out and you take out the contingent fund, where we were running about a $1.1 million shortfall before the revenue shortfall. So that's kind of where you're sitting. It would be much more helpful if they gave us an update of where our finances are. But again, I went through, and I can actually tell you, outside of personnel, what our spending was, because that's all available through the abstract of the bills.
And that's through November, Glenn?
The last report we got was through November. After that, I could do the abstract. I got all the numbers for the abstract of the bills that came through. Like right now, I know, because they did a budget transfer, that the New York State retirement and the New York State police and fire retirement, one was underestimated by 6,000, the other was overestimated. So that's going to be another $22,000. That's going to be added to the budget. Those two lines are gone.
So the revenue adjusted.
That's about $3.5 million between the police retirement line and the state retirement line. It's I think it's going to cost us $22,000 more than budgeted, and those two lines are done. They if you look in December, they did a budget transfer for that because New York State gave us the actual numbers.
So the adjusted revenue for the assumption that the parking would be collected, the net deficit, if that is all collected, was $1.1 million versus $1.1 million plus.
I am talking about the expense of retirement, police and fire retirement, and New York State retirement. Those two budget lines are, I think, about $3.5 million of our budget, and it ended up being a $26,000 shortfall. On the parking revenue, again, what you have to do is just know we have 4 months. We get $55,000 a month for parking in a perfect system. So we have a chance to get at the best, we're going to get $220,000 more for the parking. So at this point, we're already down about $150,000, because all you got to do is take the entire budget, what you collected, and then take another $220,000 off, and that's what your deficit is if everything from February, March, April, and May goes to what you thought you were going to collect last year.
Yeah, but Glenn,
Fines and forfeitures, you could do the exact same thing. You got 4 months left, and you could say this is what you thought you were going to collect. At best, on those lines, you're short. And then the one that you're really short on, because I don't know if anybody's buying passes for the railroad, but the railroad, if you look back at November, we had actually refunded more money than came in for the railroad. So
the $1.1 million that you referenced, though, that was your net after then trending forward for the revenue. Is that?
Yeah, if you're looking at, if you start to trend the revenue back, it could be more, but you've probably, between the parking and the fines and forfeitures, you're probably already down close to $1 million.
And
Or 800,000.
Where would that lead us, in your estimation, Glenn, in terms of the total shortfall, the gap, the 2.5 million or up to 2.5 million that Dan mentioned?
You're also down
Is it higher?
significantly
Is it
in all
higher
the
or
fees
lower?
collected from all the events and everything like that. You also are not going to get as much state aid. State aid was already cut 20% for this year, and there's things like we usually get reimbursements for police details. We didn't really get that amount the first month. So that's where your main shortfalls are.
Yeah, except Glenn,
Let me pull
the
this out
police,
for a second. I have the budget here, and I've actually circled a bunch of these. So just give me 1 minute.
the police detail reimbursement, we're also not spending the overtime to earn that. So that's kind of a wash.
Yeah.
I do want to unpack Glenn's question though, and it's where I was going as well, is if there's a $2 million number floating around out there, and Glenn, it sounds like you've dug fairly deep into this. What are you seeing the net shortfall if the assumptions that you just laid out all occur, that you trend the remainder of the year with the revenue being collected? I don't know if that's assuming that you're collecting in arrears on the parking tickets or not, but did you allude to netting to $1.1 million across some of these scenarios?
Yeah, well, where you are is you have shortfalls in state aid. There's some things that just got to be taken out, but they're going to be taken out on both ends. The CHIPS program, which is $237,000, we haven't done that in a couple of years. It's $237,000 out on the revenue side. It's $237,000 out of the expense side. That's going to be a wash. You would normally be getting revenue sharing. I'm not sure how much we're going to get in that. Where are we here? You have cultural and recreational programs under normal circumstances brings in $1 million. We'd only brought in $288,000. Now, some of that is going to come in because we hadn't collected any tennis fees yet. And we are going to be getting money from floats, moorings, and ramps. The question I would have, does that money go into this year's budget, or is that revenue considered next year's revenue?
I think it's this year.
Your licenses and permits looks like it's all right. Your fines and forfeitures, you're supposed to do $965,000. As of November, you did $137,000. So at the minimum, that's $400,000 down if you collected everything you were supposed to collect from December on, in a perfect world. If your number stayed down, you could have another $200,000-$300,000 deficit there. That's where they got to give us an update on where the revenues are. Real estate, you collect 100%, and you're probably going to see some money in fines and penalties because people pay the property tax late. I think you get 5% right away and then 1%. We don't carry any of the debt forward if somebody doesn't pay their real estate taxes. What Augie does in March and April, anybody who's in arrears at that point, we actually hold an auction and we sell as liens anything that we haven't collected in property tax. As opposed to the town who they're responsible if the schools don't get paid or Westchester doesn't get paid. So we actually don't carry any debt forward on arrears with property tax. That gets auctioned off once a year. But the biggest things is police traffic decal reimbursement. You know, 270,000. Now that could be a lagging figure because right now you have the gas company opening up all over, and we charge if the police go out there. But again, they would have that number. They gotta tell us, is Con Ed owe us money for police details?
Well, I mean, Glenn, all of this is very helpful, but unfortunately, it still doesn't give us a sense as to where we stand with respect to the gap and what, where your assumptions lead us to whether it's higher or lower than the 2.5 million. In other words, I'm assuming Dan was told recently that the gap was 2.5 million, or could be up to $2.5 million. And therefore we're relying on Jerry, presumably, who has more than up-to-date information than the rest of us, more up-to-date information. So I'm not quite sure sort of where we are, because presumably we'd like to be able to make some constructive suggestions to the board.
So, Len, this is my suggestion. I think the concerns are real and meaningful. I suggest you may want to outline a series of questions to put forth to the village manager, and let's see if we can get the answers.
There's a couple of other outliers that they can't do anything about. One is snow removal. If it doesn't snow, there's $200,000. If you have a couple of blizzards, then you're back into expense. The other is certiorarities, refunds on real estate. As of right now, we spent $40,000 to $50,000. There's $300,000 left, but I'm actually going to get from the town of Mamaroneck where we are. We have $400,000 in tax sororities that are open in the town of Rye. The biggest one being directors, which goes back 10 years. 3 of the years we have to defend. We gave up our assessor's office 7 years ago. So we're responsible for 2011, 2012, 2013. But the 4 that are in court currently in Rye Neck are exposure to the village of approximately $400,000. So, and then I will see where we are on the town side. They're going to send that to me in late January, early February. They're going to give me the update on that list. And the ones we're looking for are the ones that are actually have court dates. Most of those are going to be anywhere from 5 to 10 years old, because what commercial properties do is they will file a certiorari in small claims court, and what they do is they keep it active, and usually they build up 5 to 10 years. That way, when they hire the lawyer, they can reach back up to 10 years and then go forward again. So, as I said, right now, but with the courts, I don't know if it's going to be this year or next year. But those are 2 places that you have $500,000. There's another one in the budget which I can't quite figure out. Dan might help me, is the planning board, for whatever reason, is budgeted for over $300,000. I don't know if that's the Hampshire lawsuit or whatever. It shows it, but you know, they had in November $200,000 left, and then it's just a matter of. I know that Barry retired, and I don't think that they're looking to replace him right away. We haven't had a village engineer. The village manager left. I don't think they're replacing him right away. I think we're down to police officer. When the chief retired, I think everybody moved off. I don't think we're going to be hiring a replacement police officer until next year. So, I mean, I just started pulling all the records together. By the next meeting, I can really zero in on it, because again, all the spending, I can't do personnel, but the rest of the spending actually is on the abstract of all the bills that the trustees passed. So I can tell you the capital projects. I can tell you on the operating budget. I can tell you that we were over on the leaf collection because they made a budget transfer to cover the overage. So I can tell you, you know, we were over slightly with the health, community health center. We redid a roof and the back there, so they were budgeted for $53,000. The entire thing came out to $60,000. So you know, there's $7,000 there. So you can go through the budget. The law budget is shot unless they, you know, some of that should have been assigned to the planning board for the Hampshire case. Otherwise, that budget is very close to being spent out.
And the other concern I have in terms of gaps, and Lynn and I had been emailing on this, early in the budget document that's on the village website, I want to say it's around page 9, it says our debt service is 2.7 million. And around page 104, it says it's 3.7 million. So there's a potential 1 mil, and the budgeted figures on the spreadsheet that Augie sent us last time are close to the 2.7. But I don't know what that 3.7 is, which Augie also told us months ago the debt service was 3.7 million. So that's another potential $1 million gap.
Well, we also bonded for over $5 million.
I think to Dan's point of our putting together a list of questions, you know, certainly if available, the updated financials, you know, presented in a way where a lot of the variances that Glenn just went through are in front of us so that we can analyze them, and then comments with what the assumptions are between now and the rest of the year to trend. And then we have a document now that summarizes a lot of Jerry's corresponding recommendations that we can digest and probably come back with questions off of that document. Ellen has presented a specific question that could have significant meaning in this discussion. So that's another one. And if we can all share our questions and then try to get the information with updated financials as a I think an important starting point, you know, we'll then have facts in front of us as a group that we can analyze and digest, and then maybe come up with some of our own independent recommendations.
By the way, last year's audited financial report is available for you to read online. It's 84 pages. It was presented at the last meeting of the trustees. If you go to the meetings and agenda on the village website, there's a link right there. Basically, we ended the year with $42 million worth of bonds and we had $10 million worth of unallotted expense, most of it through the water fund.
Yeah, I think what is good for everyone to look at, and I could send it to the committee, I just looked today, is really the auditor's presentation to the board, which summarizes things quite nicely. Now, Ellen, getting to your point, in the last fiscal year, the debt service number was $2,680,000. That's what the auditor, O'Connor Davies, reported in the audit, $2,680,000
Okay.
for debt service. In a fund balance of about 14.3 million at the year-end fund balance. That was for last fiscal year audit. So, and it gives some expense trends at a fairly high level, which I think is good. It's reasonably well done. At least it could give the committee members a sense as to where we've been over the last 5 years, because they have some 5-year trends. That's nice, but of course the current year and next year are going to be really out of whack. But anyway, so that's an important document, as well as the full audit if you want to go through and read all the notes and so on.
So what you just said on the debt service is very much in line with the 2.7 million that the numbers added up to on the financials, as well as what was early on in the budget document. We still need to understand what that other debt service schedule was that listed out multiple years that had 3.7 million.
You're exactly right. It doesn't remove the question. It only maybe gives us a little more comfort in terms of the what the real number is. At least as reported in the audits.
Right. If the real number for this year is 3.7, we've got a much bigger problem.
That's right. But it can't be. I guess, was it Glenn or something? We had what, 5 million in financing? That certainly wouldn't be $1 million in debt service.
No.
I'm trying to find right now.
But anyway, getting back to what Charles was saying in terms of the steps on how to proceed, because we do have, and as Dan suggested, we do have a lot of questions. There's no doubt about that.
Now remember, if you take out the if you take out of the budget the storm fund, and you take out of the budget the pandemic fund, and you take out the contingency, the budget started with a deficit of approximately $1.1 million. 600 of that 600,000 of that was to come out of the general fund.
if everybody wants to circulate their bullet point questions, and then, I can consolidate them for Dan, and share them with the group first. And if anybody wants to, weigh in on questions that were presented, we can do that. If we feel like we need another meeting to go through the questions, that's one thing. But if we can, have a comfort level that the questions that are being presented make sense, and that we're in agreement that, they should be presented to the board, if we can get that consensus, then give that to Dan to move forward with, and then try to get questions answered, and we can reconvene on this, hopefully with some more answers in the meantime, or next month. We touched a little, we jumped kind of out of order on the agenda, but the capital budget as well, a status as to what has actually been spent, what's in the process of being spent, whatever the word was we used for like those allocated funds that haven't hit the book, and then what's, realistically being projected to be spent for the rest of the year, I think would be valuable to take a look at. It was a very light number when we last looked at it, but that might be misleading. And again, why do we want to go through that exercise? I think that we've been looking at the capital budget in the context of a, 5-year trend with multiple projects as moving parts. And if significant capital expenditures that were budgeted this year aren't happening, they will likely flow forward into subsequent years, which then impacts those years. And that's something that we could then start getting our heads around in terms of, helping to model that, looking at it and understanding it. But again, knowing where we stand and then being able to look at it in the context of now and in subsequent years, I think would be valuable. So same concept. If anybody has questions specific to beyond what I just suggested with the capital budget, and there are big line items, and I'm sure people have questions more specifically. So if we can present those as well, I think it's great.
But Charles, one thing I'm not sure if it's a question for anyone to work on now, but with last year's budget process, we asked for a 5-year capital plan. I don't think we intended that to be a one-shot deal.
Absolutely.
So we should always have a rolling 5-year capital plan.
That's right.
And looking at what Dan just shared with us prior to the meeting, Jerry's gotten the expense and revenue budget, but nothing about capital.
There's one reference.
Yeah, there's one there, Number 7 on that memo, Alan.
Yep.
Hang on. Let me take another look.
Second page, I think. Dan, can I ask a question? Is Jerry and or the board aware that you shared this memo with us?
I have not asked them. I asked them originally and they said not before the staff was informed. The staff was informed, so I have now gone ahead and shared it with you.
Oh, okay.
All right. So I just took a look. Number 7's not really addressing what I was mentioning. So as Jerry's received budget submissions from the department heads, I don't think he has gotten an up-to-date capital spending request from the department heads going forward for 5 years.
Yeah, okay, if that's what you're referring to, yes.
Yeah.
As opposed to capital expenditures for this year.
Correct.
Because clearly he wants to continue with this at least a sizable project.
Yep.
But I'm just trying to think, Dan, of the most constructive way. My concern is about writing about some questions, is that given the state of affairs, it will take us time to get together the questions, and then, there's a risk that there will be no response. And quite frankly, personally, I'm happy, perhaps tactically, we could think about making some suggestions or recommendations or suggestions with some questions to be answered as part of that document. But it might be helpful for us to, recommend some actions.
Well, Len, I think your rewrite of my document was phenomenal. You did a great job on that. And I agree in theory that, we should be making recommendations, but I think at this point, given what Dan shared with us, Jerry's trying to get his arms around this. And I'm not sure there's really a whole lot that we can recommend that he hasn't thought of.
Well, I'll be blunt. He's trying to get his arms around it. And in my opinion, this presentation leaves a lot, and I underline the word lot, to be desired at this point in the fiscal year.
Yep.
So therefore, there's plenty of things I'm sure we could suggest that might be helpful. But anyway, I guess I have a particular view and a particular significant disappointment about this document.
Well, at this point, quite frankly, I think they're well on the way with the budget. They've already set the fees for recreation. They've already set the fees for parking, the docks, boating, and such. So it's obvious that they have an idea of what they're looking for budget-wise. On the capital spending, we have that available. It's just a little bit of work. I printed it out, but I can get further into it. Again, capital spending all comes down to the audits of the bills. On the bottom of the audit bills, it says exactly what they spent on capital and also what they've authorized. Like I said, they went out and bonded. They closed the bonds on 4 items, including the fire truck, and that came up to a little over $5 million. And if you give me 1 minute, you can keep talking. I could probably go to the village website and pull up exactly what they have bonded. I believe it was at end of somewhere in like October or September, but they closed the bond, and the only question I would have is, did we actually go out to bid, and did we actually issue the bonds? The other thing is, a lot of the stuff that's under capital did get paid for, and then it shows up as, in the expense report. Things that weren't bonded were paid for. Again, on the end of the audit of the bills, it will tell you that we bought the car for Jerry. We did the repairs on Stanley Avenue. We did the deck on the EMS. We got replacement police cars. We bought the dump trucks with the plows. It has a whole list of items. We have the camera truck that was bought. We did a big repaving project on Flagler Avenue. We did another one on Weaver Street.
You know what the total is?
They all those costs are involved, and then you have two lines that don't appear on the actual budget line that are there. One is sanitary sewer, which is, I guess they're putting that all under capital, which we spent, I think, $102,000 on. And then you have something under called meter, which is meter rental, but it's also water and such. And that's got like 1.1 or $1.2 million that we spent.
Glenn, did you say we paid for repaving of Flagler?
What's that?
Did you say we paid for repaving Flagler Drive?
Yeah, that was
That's a private road. Why is the village paying for that?
no. It's the water project. We replaced the water pipes in the main for Flagler Drive. And that's
Okay.
actually part of a lawsuit, whether we're responsible for it or it should be private.
Right. Okay.
But what I'm saying is that if you actually look at the abstract of the bills, and on the bottom, every single time something in it with a capital project was done, it appears there. What it was spent on,
You know
what
what
was done.
the year-to-date total is?
I'd have to go and re-add them all up, because what happens is they are charged back to where they are. In other words, we're paying the capital project, but we're actually paying that out of this year's budget. In other words, let's say you had 50,000. Either it's we paid $700,000 for paving or something like that. So certain items go, against, the smaller items. If it's 50, 60,000, well, that's an expense that is eaten in whatever line it goes under. The $60,000 for the community center was charged to the community center's budget line, which was either 52 or 53,000. So that's $6,000 that had to be transferred to make that line whole.
When did the Flagler 3 million plus hit the books?
I think it's like 1 million, and I'd have to go look.
The Flagler payments were over a period of time charged to the waterfront account, if you will.
Mhm.
It had, to the best of my knowledge, that has not yet been bonded.
Yeah, there's a line for water meter, and I think it was like $1 million. Flagler was part of that. We don't have that line in our budget, but online there is an account, and that goes against the water fund, and we actually rent the hydrants for either $6,000 or $8,000. So you see that come up in the line, and then there was one big charge of over $1 million.
And that goes to the same point of the operating budget, is to have a year-to-date breakdown of where we are with the capital budget would be a helpful starting point. I think when it was last reported to us, it was at $1.6 million in November. But the point was made that there were a lot of projects that hadn't hit the books yet, but were going to hit the book. So getting that update would be valuable. And then in addition to that, what the plan is for this, second half-ish of the year to move forward with. But just meanwhile, back on the operating budget rant, if you look to the bottom of the document that was shared, all of the cuts that are being considered, there's still a $900,000 shortfall that would have to be made up without exceeding the cap. So, determining whether that's, an accurate number through projections and analyzing all of the assumptions at hand is one thing. And if that's the reality, then there's a lot to look at based on the document that's been on the screen the whole meeting in terms of criteria and decision-making processes to go about addressing a $900,000 shortfall. The recommendation is to not exceed the cap, but if you can't realistically make that up, then that's a big part of the conversation. But our being able as, a team of people with the whole purpose of this committee being that people with different expertise who represent the community have the opportunity to look at information and share recommendations and opinions is all we're really looking to do here. If we don't have the information, what's the point of this?
Right. The other thing also, and I've brought this up before, but something Len said a while back brought it back to mind. Given where we are right now, I think one of the recommendations we should make is a real solid forecast for the remainder of the year needs to be made for revenue and expense, as opposed to guessing games. Because our budget is just a budget. It's not a month by month plan.
Absolutely.
I mean, as Dan said, of course there are a lot of variables. There's no doubt about that. But part of the role of the staff, and of course, even with our help, is you should have sort of best case, worst case, or expected case. But clearly having an outlook for the rest of this year, a forecast, and then as Charles just referred to, the impact on next year's budget, the $900,000, is an issue that has to be always kept in the back of mind, because what we do this year, some or much of it will carry over into the next fiscal year. If you add up everything that's in Jerry's letter, we're somewhere between, just using his numbers and just, making rough estimates, we're somewhere between 850,000 and maybe close to $1 million in saving if everything gets done and everything works perfectly. Anyway, so my only point here is getting back to Charles's earlier suggestion about how we put something together and be able to get it to the board. At least, I don't know if people are feeling, maybe there is or there is not a sense of urgency, but it would seem that that if we could do something in a reasonable period of time and share with the board our thoughts from the specific to the general, it could be helpful.
Dan, do you think the board would be receptive to hearing our thoughts?
I think the board is always receptive to hearing constructive suggestions. So I think the suggestion is meaningful. I think the question is in a form that is pointing out what the issues are and, some suggestions of what to do and questions that of information that is needed to be further helpful.
Have you had a chance to read the document that Charles has up on the screen? I believe you were on the emails with it. Maybe
Yes.
not.
Yes, I have. Yes.
Are you okay with this document?
Again, I think that this is a proactive approach, not an accusatory approach. It is meaningful. It is taking a look at things that need to be looked at.
So and again, it's just a great effort by the group to pull this together as quickly as it was done. And, thank you for everyone who put the time and effort into it. And there've been, a number of revisions that have been made. We could always keep working on it, but I think it's a great document. And given the, time sensitivity and that there is urgency, that we have an issue on our hands as a village that we put this document through. I mean, I can make the motion that we submit it as is, unless somebody wants to address, and if anybody wants to address anything.
Charles, this is Ed Zagajewski. I thought we were going to share this with Augie and Jerry before we gave it to the board.
Yeah,
Except, Ed, we had discussed that. Maybe Lynn and I just had the sideline conversation. We're here because of the board, not because of Augie and Jerry.
Well, it's, my view from some of the things we did last year, that it seems that it's always good to have the staff on board, before the Board of Trustees sees it. I'm not sure that, unless the staff is in somewhat agreement with it, it's not going to go anywhere.
I think, Ed, you make a very fair point, except Charles most prominently has tried to get in touch with Augie more than once. He has not been responsive. And
well, but then what we can do is we can send it to them, ask them to give us comments by a particular date, and if they don't, then we send it to the board. But at least we reached out to them. We can document that we reached out to them, and then we, I agree with you that we need to get this to the board, but I just don't think it's helpful to get it to the board without the staff having an opportunity. If they don't want to take the opportunity, then we tell the board that.
Okay, that's not unreasonable. What I'd like to offer a suggestion then is we take a close look at what we got from Jerry, edit this document accordingly, because there's some overlap clearly, and add some of the points that were made earlier, like about the forecast for the year, or projection, I think, as Ellen said, and perhaps prior to the conclusion have a section where it has I'll just make up a name, the key questions to be answered. Maybe we put together a list of questions that we might recommend that the board ask or be asked in order to wrap our arms around not just this year, but also going into next year. So it'd be a slight modification it'd be a modification of what Charles has before us.
Sure, I think that's a good suggestion, Ron.
I do have a bunch of printouts. We're talking about capital spending. I have one here. This was dated November 23rd, 2020. Accepting Joint Waterworks project purchase booster pump station modification and related upgrades. Basically, total estimated cost of work is 1.722 million, and the village's cost is going to be 478,716. That's for the installation of 3 SMG pumps with a variable frequency drive control, electrical and instrumental upgrades, replacement and upgrade of the station's interior piping, replacement of the existing 230 kW emergency power generator with 205 kW emergency power generators and other related work.
Well, I'm not sure that the waterworks stuff is part of the village's operating budget. I thought when Dan addressed some of the waterworks capital, that comes out of the water fund. So I mean, I'm not sure how relevant that is to the issues concerning our current operating budget or even our current capital.
Well,
budget.
I'm just slowly but surely going through all the, remember, every single thing that we do is that central communication was over budget, so we transferred $114,000 out of the general fund. We have.
Wait, can we, before you start?
Oh, here's a big one. We contracted the sanitary sewer rehabilitation. And
can we finish the discussion on this document before we start getting into those details, Glenn?
Sure.
So we know what we're doing going forward?
Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say, the last recommendation was from Len that we modify this document to incorporate Jerry's document and potentially update it with a couple of other comments. Are we then sending it to the board and Jerry and Augie? Are we sending it to Jerry and Augie with a please respond by X date?
I think giving Jerry and Augie a window to review and respond seems like it would be the right thing to do. And if they don't respond or have suggestions, we can also make the point that we're, the plan is to ultimately submit this to the board.
Okay, so how much time are we giving them?
There's
And I'm
urgency
only
here.
asking because here we are in the middle of January. We have to keep moving, or it's a waste of time.
I also think you need to build in a framework of working with them, on the new budget, which is supposed to be taking place now, but seems to be delayed.
Yeah, there's there is that. And I just wanted to touch on one. So we should agree on a review period as a group. And I just wanted to also bridge that we have the capital budget recommendation document that we went through the process, and it's a question of that being adopted, if you will. And I think that that document serves as more of a a longer term framework that can be used across, into the future. If we look at the operating budget guidelines, it's structured more as a current analysis.
Yep.
And to Len's suggestion of incorporating, information from what Jerry put together, that's very, logical, given the way that this document was structured, that it is current. But that maybe we just have to clarify that this document, is more current, and less of the like longer term framework that could be used in perpetuity, the way that the capital budget guidelines were, and that
Yep.
maybe we as a group, subsequently formulate an operating budget guideline document that is not, fiscal year specific. But
Well,
that's just that we're making that point, which the document reads that way, but just to clarify.
Right, but I think my initial document, before it was rewritten, was more general.
Right, so we can maybe pick it back up and take away the fiscal specificity going forward, but certainly in this environment, the way that we have it structured, but just so that they understand, Jerry, Augie, the board, and that we're on the same page, that, these are sort of two different types of documents, and that there will probably be a third that we're planning on putting forth. That's the, more general operating budget guideline framework.
Yep.
And I don't know if we want to change the title of this to reference the fiscal year in the title. I mean, obviously the body of the document, is very specific with that. We have bolded fiscal year 2021, et cetera. And I'm fine with it, but just that.
No, you're right. I think we do need to change the title of this because it's not
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah,
overall
yeah,
budget guidelines. It's
Yeah.
very focused.
yeah.
Do you want to just put the fiscal year 2021 budget advisory committee
Yep.
budget advisory committee, fiscal 2021 operating budget guidelines?
Well, I would add in 22 there because we do have a section on 22.
Yep.
And it's also mentioned in the Jerry's memo.
Right. So you want to just say fiscal 20 to 22?
Yeah.
Yeah. What if I have a suggestion? If I have a suggestion, Ed, Ellen, and I sort of kicked around, and there were modifications made to the document that's in front of us now. Suppose we use the same subcommittee. I'm volunteering us, Ellen and Ed, as you can hear.
Well, I was going to volunteer you to do the wordsmithing, so you're fine.
Well, I mean, I'll do the wordsmith first cut, but then I insist that you guys will take a look at it. What I'm trying to do is to set some deadlines here.
Absolutely.
Because it's not a matter, the first step is not getting a response from Augie and Jerry. The first step is coordinating this committee's the document that we're actually going to share with them. So we have to start at the beginning. So I'm volunteering this subcommittee with me taking the first cut, and so that we can get something off the ground, so to speak.
That's fine with me.
I'm okay.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I like work.
That's good.
I certainly like working with both of you, so.
Thanks, Ed.
I don't know, Charles. That's just a suggestion.
That's great. I really, that's much appreciated. And I guess when we feel like we're ready, we can then present it to Jerry and Augie for a look, and then hopefully to the board. And
Right,
we'll
but
go
I
from
think
there.
we need to do that quickly. So I'm going to just start making updates. It's not real. But let's say Len gets his revisions to Ed and me tomorrow. I said it's not real, Len, so that's okay.
Oh, maybe
Um,
tomorrow's not so.
All right, I'll give you till Thursday, but
Okay,
you know,
good.
Ed,
That's even better.
okay, and then Ed and I review it, you know, let's say by Sunday, the three of us are happy with the document.
Yeah.
If
I'm good
we
with
get it
that.
out to the committee, we need a response right away from everyone
Yep.
so that we can get it to Jerry and Augie quickly.
Yeah, why don't we say that we'll give the committee, after we receive it from you, call it 48 hours to respond.
Okay,
And at that point, you know, it's just it's a go, you know, no more comments after 48 hours, if we're all in agreement with that.
Yes,
okay, so we then get, so we have 48 hours for us to respond. And then one of us, it could be me, it could be you, Charles, you know, we could figure that out. We send it to Jerry and Augie. How long do we give them to respond? A week?
I was thinking a week.
Okay,
Everybody all right with a week being reasonable?
Oh,
I'm fine.
I'm okay.
Okay.
And then after that week, we've, I don't know, Dan, do we ask you to forward it to the board or do we forward it directly?
Let's see what we get back from Jerry and Augie. You know,
Okay,
At the
that would be
very
helpful.
least,
Then you may need to edit again what you have. What I'm trying to
Okay.
do is get this to them, to our board, before your next meeting, because at your next meeting is after the first board meeting in February.
right.
As far as the questions that we want answered, you know, because that's another piece. And again, I'll just say it again, you know, getting current financial
Yeah.
statements is, you know, really an important starting point. And
yeah,
if they're not available, they're not available. But if they're available, I think would like to be able to analyze them. But
Well,
again,
in Jerry's note that Dan shared, it said that they're providing monthly financials to the board.
And there's no reason that they can't be shared with the budget committee.
Correct, especially since Augie shared it with us previously.
and then I know there are other questions. So as a separate communication, I mean, I don't think we want to commingle it with the document, but as a separate communication, here is a consolidated list of questions from the committee in addition to this document.
So let's say, all right, so Charles, you said you would coordinate or consolidate all the questions. Let's say we as a committee have a week to get them to you.
I think that is perfect.
So by next Tuesday.
Yep. Everybody okay with that? Questions to me by Tuesday, I'll turn around integrating them into as they come and then into a single, you know, document, you know, we'll call it Wednesday, Thursday, right after I receive them.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you, Joe. Ellen, are you going to send around your schedule that you're holding?
I can, but it's also in the minutes.
Okay, you're going to send out the minutes tonight, right?
No, I'm not. But I will send tonight all of our immediate deadlines. I'll get an email out to everyone.
I'm only joking.
No, you're not.
Just it's great working with you guys. This is, you know, it's a challenging environment in general right now. It's great to just be involved with all of you. So I think we can maybe make a motion to adjourn unless anybody has anything else.
Charles,
Charles, can you stop sharing your screen for a minute?
Sure.
Charles, let me just ask, how is you and your family doing now? I remember you weren't feeling well.
Thank you. It was 5 weeks of hell for me, and I finally came out of it, and as did my wife, but she's lingering a little bit more than I am right now, and with fatigue, and it was rough.
Yeah.
5 weeks. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was brutal. And no lung issues, thank God.
Good.
Yeah.
Because at the last meeting, you were concerned about pneumonia, I believe.
Yeah, the doctor was concerned about pneumonia, and I think that all the drugs that he prescribed, steroids and the like, are debatable, but maybe that prevented the lung issues. But hopefully none of you guys going forward get this, and if you do, you know, the medicine was, I think, really rough, so it's something to consider whether to take it.
Whoa. But glad to hear you're doing better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Should we do make a motion to adjourn unless anybody had anything?
I'll move to adjourn.
A second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. I know the board appreciates all your hard work. Thank you kindly.
All right,
All
thanks.
right, thank
Likewise,
you.
Dan.
Have a good
All right.
night.
Good night.
Night.